Well, thank you very much, Mr. Vinayak Godse, for that comprehensive presentation on accelerating cybersecurity research and innovation. We'll now move on to our next segment, which is once again a plenary session on Quad, the cybersecurity capabilities, collective efforts for research and education. Now, to moderate the session, we have amongst us this afternoon Mr. Deepak Maheshwari, Public Policy Consultant, and to talk to us and share with us their insights, Ms. Aditi Chaturvedi, Head Law and Policy with Koan Advisory Group, Ms. Sonia Arakkal, Policy Fellow at Perth US Asia Center, and Mr. Pranay Kotasthane, who is the Deputy Director at Takshila Institute. And as you may be able to see on your screens, we already have our panelists here. And without any further ado, I am going to hand it over to the session moderator, Mr. Deepak Maheshwari, to take it forward from here. Thank you.
Pranay?
Hi, Mr. Maheshwari, I'll request you to start the session.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Samriddhi. And good afternoon, everyone. Deepak Maheshwari here. And this particular session, what we are going to focus on is how do we utilize the opportunity of the Quad? Quad itself as a concept is not that old. It's just a few years old in terms of geopolitical arena. But at the same time, what we have seen is that this is something which has evolved very, very quickly into something which is multifaceted right now. So across the US, India, Japan, and Australia. And how is it that we can use this particular platform of Quad to deal with the growing challenges of cybersecurity around the world? And of course, specifically within the India, how do we look at these things in terms of research as well as for innovation? So we do have three panelists with us. We have Pranay from Takshila Institution. We have Sonia from Perth US Asia Center. And we have Aditi from Koan Advisory Group. So what we're going to do in this particular session is, I would like to each of them to focus on one particular dimension, of course, within the concept of Quad. And then initially, I'll request them to limit their responses to about 4 or 5 minutes. And after that, we'll do one or two more rounds of questions. And in case the audience have any questions, my request is that they can type in the questions in the box, and we'll take up those questions also as we go along. So when we are looking at this whole concept of Quad itself, Pranay, let me start with you on this. How do you see the evolution of Quad, not in general, but very specifically in terms of the way high tech and the cybersecurity arena itself is evolving in the past few years? And of course, the recent declaration which happened about 6 or 7 weeks back in September end itself. And where do you see that thing going on? Because we do have a lot of declarations which keep on happening. So any summit, any sort of major dialogue, it does have close with some uh, sort of declaration, some sort of affirmation or assessment of the situation. But what is the pathway that you see going ahead? Because what we are seeing is right now, whether it's India or US or for that matter, many other countries, on one hand, there's a lot of focus on self reliance in some name or the other. On the other hand, there's also this tendency about sort of working with others, with allies in different dimensions. So, how do you see this particular thing playing out in the long run? Yeah, Pranay.
Thanks, Deepak. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. So let me begin with this. As you rightly said, there is this sort of a tug of war between this idea of complete self-reliance, and the fact that most of the technology supply chains today are global. So right, there is, one needs to strike a balance between them. So regarding the Quad, I think there has been a lot of progress over the last 6 7 months, and multilateral cooperation generally is quite slow. But I would say, by judging by those standards, the progress on in the Quad has been quite fast. So if you look at it, there was a critical and emerging technology working group which was established in the March meeting. Back then there was no common understanding even of what does this term critical and emerging technologies mean. Is there a common understanding between all four countries or not? But from then on, I think it's moved quite fast, and it's no longer the case. The critical and emerging technology working group has done a prioritization exercise, and if you see the last meeting, we saw they have zeroed in on a few areas: space, biotechnology, 5G communications, cyber security, and semiconductors. So looks like there has been a prioritization which has happened, and that's a really positive sign. Broadly, I would like to just make 3 points that I think the Quad group should focus on technology collaboration for 3 reasons. Reason one, I think there is a convergence of values, interests, and strengths in this group. Why I say that is, by values, I mean, if you look at the Quad Principles document which was released, there is already a lot of arguments made about how there is an alignment of values, especially giving importance to individual rights, privacy, etc. So that those values alignment is there. The second one is interest. I think the political interest of this group is quite clear. And there is a realization that China used globalization to its advantage while blocking other countries from access to its technology market. So there is an alignment of interest that needs to be changed in the new post-pandemic world. And the third one is strengths. There are complementary strengths between these four groups. So if you see, US leads on a lot of intellectual property work, Japan leads in precision manufacturing, Australia has a lead on things like battery storage and quantum computing, and India has the human capital to make all of this work. So sort of there is a coming together of all these things in this group. The second reason why I think Quad is well focused is because it is a positive agenda on which many other countries can rally around. So this works well if you see geopolitically from the perspective of other countries as well. And finally, I think the Quad is a small group, small enough group to get started, unlike the T12 or D10 groups which have been talked about earlier, where there is a lot of confrontation and misalignment of what should be done between the countries in the group itself. So within the Quad, that sort of problem is less. So I think Quad is a good point to build what my colleague Nitin calls the bubbles of trust. So start with a small group, get things going on the 5 areas that I talked about, and then grow that into a bigger bubble, coalesce it with other partners as we move on. So from that perspective, I think Quad is well positioned. And I have worked on the semiconductor side, and I clearly see there are a lot of complementary strengths between these four groups, and that's why you also saw supply chain semiconductor supply chain initiative being launched in the last Quad meeting. There is a positive move. All these countries are realizing that self-sufficiency in the technology arena is not the best way to go forward. Whatever one country might be able to do, attaining complete self-sufficiency is not a possibility, and hence I see this move in the right direction.
Definitely. Thanks, Pranay, for this. So you are saying in terms of, values, strengths, and interests, then of course the positive agenda, and of course the small enough to get this whole thing kick-started. So let me move over to Sonia. So Sonia, you have written a lot and you have researched a lot on um, USA, Australia, but not just US, Australia, including of course on the Quad issue also. At the same time, what we also observed in Australia, for example, there have been some very specific type of legislative moves at a domestic level in Australia. So there was this whole thing about uh, the assistance for encryption, for example, I mean, for decryption in a way. Okay. And then, of course, we also saw these negotiations with the social media companies and with the research aggregators, etc. Now, these are the type of things that a particular country is doing, let's say, at a domestic front. And at the same time, when it is coming as a member of the Quad, what we are seeing is it has a very broader, different type of agenda. So, how do you see these two things coexisting, reconciling across these two different dimensions?
Thank you, Deepak. And I think you've hit the nail on the head there about some of the tensions within the Quad that might get in the way of the ambitions or the rosy picture that Pranay has just painted. While I agree with his interventions that, theoretically, this is exactly the space the Quad should be playing in. And indeed, we are seeing after the recent leaders meeting that they are acting on their intentions through the critical working group, there will be some limits, a lot based on either domestic appetite for regulation or domestic politics. And I'll come to that. But before we talk about the limits, let's talk about the good news story and about the evidence that we can point to that the Quad is already in this space. And indeed, the Australia-India bilateral is in the cyber and critical technology space and elevating it. Just last week, Prime Minister Modi spoke at the Sydney Dialogue, and the Sydney Dialogue was a space where the policymakers from around the world came to talk about cyber and critical technologies. Prime Minister Modi gave the keynote address, and before him, Prime Minister Morrison also spoke. As a part of Prime Minister Morrison's address, he announced that there would be an Australian consulate established in Bengaluru. And in fact, he then went on to speak at the Bangalore Tech Summit and announced the Centre for Cyber and Cyber-Enabled Critical Technology. So this is a huge area for both Australia and India, not just within the Quad, but also bilaterally. Australia has been engaging with India in cybersecurity for many years and in a very deep way. And I think cybersecurity is one of the specific areas within critical technologies where there is the most room to establish some norms within the Quad, especially when it comes to attribution of cyber attacks. Now, we've talked about, the Sydney Dialogue, the Quad, the commitments both bilaterally and multilaterally to cooperating in this area. But I would like to put on the table some of the limits to cooperation. Importantly, when we talk about cooperation in cyber and critical technologies, these are really sensitive technologies and areas which can bring huge military defense or strategic benefits to countries. And I'm a little bit wary, given that the Quad is not a technical cooperation agreement or even an intelligence sharing agreement, that really substantive cooperation can happen between the Quad countries without agreements to that effect. And if anything has brought that into focus, it is the AUKUS agreement. So if we want to be developing as Quad countries or bilaterally Australia and India, the cutting edge in cyber threat assessments, in cyber offensive capabilities, in the quantum technologies that Pranay mentioned, there needs to be a more substantive cooperation agreement in place that covers both technical cooperation and intelligence sharing. And that is just a nature of the kind of research that's required in this area, cannot be done without sharing of sensitive information. And unfortunately, the Quad is not yet at a level where they, as far as I know, where they have agreed to that level of deep cooperation. The other kind of limit cooperation that I'd like to put on the table is, though we have shared values, we express those values, each country in the Quad, in slightly different ways. A fun example is TikTok. So we know that India has banned TikTok, but the other three countries haven't. You also see this illustrated in the Quad countries' approaches to Huawei and how they have managed the risks associated with 5G rollout. And each country has approached it in a slightly different way. Australia was first out of the gates, and they very clearly banned both Huawei as an operator and as a technology provider. Whereas my understanding of the Indian context is that though Huawei is banned as an operator, there are it is more being sidelined as a technology operator and provider to Indian operators, and that is not explicit in the Indian legislation. So, you know, I bring up the TikTok and Huawei examples not to say that, you know, the values are different. I agree they're the same, but when it push comes to shove, due to economic, geopolitical, and security considerations, countries will act in different ways. And that are the kinds of things that we need to overcome when we talk about cyber and critical technology research in the Quad.
Okay, thanks, Sonia. So, Aditi, when we are looking at in India, so in India, a couple of things come to my mind. One is obviously there was this talk about national cybersecurity strategy, which the Prime Minister had announced last year on 15th of August, that it is in the works and it should be coming out anytime. So that's one. And second thing, we have also seen that, for example, in India, we are also now getting ready for the G20 leadership next year. Okay, and also India has similar type of, I'll say, not as accentuated announcements or affirmance as we have seen in the case of Quad, but nevertheless, almost all the recent bilateral or multilateral agreements that we have seen do entail some element of cyber cooperation. So it could be a small country, it could be a big country, it could be a developing country, it could be a developed country, whichever way. And within that, how do you see the prioritization for Quad coming up front and center? And second, in terms of the, if you see cybersecurity, and Sonia did mention about attribution. Now, even if you have attribution, ultimately, one of the important things is that you should be in a position to get that information and have some sort of a prosecution, which results in a deterrence ultimately in some prosecution that way. And there, the only instrument right now we have in terms of the cyber crime per se is the Budapest Convention at this point of time. Now, there obviously India is not yet a member of the Budapest Convention. We have not yet signed that. So how do you see that, for example, the other three countries here, they are all in the Budapest Convention, whereas India is not. And in that scenario, so even if we have, let's say, this type of cybersecurity arrangement, so there this cooperation and there's a potential intelligence exchange and other things which are not yet there, as Sonia very rightly mentioned, it's not yet publicly at least announced that way, but hopefully these things should fall in place. But ultimately, even with those things, without having an ability to exchange information on an operational level, how do we make the most of this opportunity from Quad?
Right. So I just want to begin with saying that, these cyber issues are pervasive. We cannot pin them down to a specific system or, a particular product. But as we have seen that, now that technology has become global and it's dominating all kinds of markets. And we are what we are essentially noticing is that these are all interdependent, right? And hence controlling a certain kind of vulnerability in tech has become even more complicated because tech supply chains are such, or the development of tech is such that these are coming from probably they're scattered all over the world. So that is probably what we fundamentally need to understand here is the nature of tech in itself. How are we trying to resolve this issue of security in tech? So fundamentally, the nature of tech is that we cannot have local conversations and then try to resolve this issue of cybersecurity or security in tech at a global level. So our first approach should be to at least understand what kind of tech we are dealing with, and tech today will be very different from tech of tomorrow. So we're going to be probably looking at more and more emerging tech, which are riding on the backbone of AI, ML, and things will eventually change. So we will probably, what I feel is that India needs to have very, very needs to form communities, have very strong evolve first principles of how to deal with the kind of first principles as to the kind of collaborations or the kind of or how to work around it. I'll give you an example. When we look at AI, for example, what we essentially notice is engineers work in isolation, right? And technology is evolving, and and what businesses are doing is not very sufficient. So how do we eventually come to a point where we can have more and more security related collaboration, right? So one way of doing it is through talking to businesses, getting more and more support from them. But other kind of aim could be, let's say, in AI, where even when we talk about ethics of AI, we only and only try to emulate what probably what is happening in some other countries. But do we have a more regional approach to it? Maybe we could evolve some criteria that is more important to us, so that we can produce trustworthy products in our systems. So this is the kind of approach that we'll have to evolve. Secondly is that India will have to really reassess how are we translating our economic, social, and political realities at an international level, whether it's at the level of framing getting into a pact with some other country, or an agreement or a treaty with any other country. How do we really eventually translate all of this there? For example, I think Sonia also mentioned something about 5G, and be it our standards, like India is stuck between this whole concept of giving more access to people versus jeopardizing, let's say, itself, in the sense isolating itself from the larger 5G standards. That is one. Or let's say we are big on data sovereignty, and I understand that, because probably India realized much later that how digital economies have progressed, and to take benefit of this, how do we protect our data, or how do we utilize it in the maximum possible manner? So again, these are many interrelated issues that actually come in the way of us working together for promoting economic growth, or even for plugging security related issues. So this is something that we'll really have to introspect and figure out whether we can come together. One thing is very important, which I see, is that when we look at the recent development around G7, and when we see US Japan's policy dialogue around data flows, these are actually in complete contrast to what India has been planning to do. If you see the groupings also, they promote data free flow of trust. But what about India? Where does we may sign many as many regulations as we want to, but how are we really working at a more practical level? This is something I think we will need to evaluate.
Okay. So, Pranay, when we are looking at this whole thing around supply chain, ultimately, apart from the software, the moment we look at the hardware, the chips actually, and you didn't mention about semiconductor industry. I mean, chips is, I'll say, software is more distributed in terms of, let's say, from the places where one could potentially get or obtain that software and the services, compared to the hardware and the chips for those. And in that scenario, if we see, so for example, yes, there's a quad is there, but across all the quad, none of the four countries actually produce most of the chips in-house in any of these countries. Okay, so there may be companies, they may be headquartered there, they might be producing elsewhere. Some of that stuff, but other stuff is actually being produced in some other countries, specifically in Taiwan, for example. Okay, and not just one company, multiple companies. So that's one challenge. And the second thing, as Aditi just mentioned, in terms of these different type of groupings, what else is happening in those groupings? So right now, for example, what type of first principles should actually be guiding us when we are looking at these type of assurances across getting a better supply chain systems in place, rather than just having these affirmments. I mean, these affirmments and announcements are important, these declarations are important, but ultimately we do need something beyond these at an operational level for things to operate. And for example, we did sign CCRA a few years back, but then we came up with some profiles which are CCRA plus. So even if you have a CCRA certification elsewhere, it's probably not that really practical in India to use that. So in that scenario, what are those first principles that we should be developing, not just in India, but I'm saying across the Quad, to ensure that we have better controls on these supply chains, where we have an assurance from end to end on cybersecurity.
Deepak, is that question
Yep.
for me? Yeah.
Yes, for you.
Yeah, so I just lost you in between, but you were mentioning about
Okay.
the fact that none of the four Quad countries have semiconductor manufacturing. Did you mention that?
In a big way.
Yeah.
In a big way.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yes.
So yeah, I'll take that. So first of all, yeah, there is, the countries do have manufacturing ability. It's just that you don't have the leading edge node manufacturing, which is there in Taiwan and South Korea. But US does have a lot of semiconductor manufacturing at home as well. So yeah, that exists. So that's why what I meant to say is that start with Quad as a group where you can start this bubble where you can get people in and start initially building trust in each other's systems, and then you can add other countries, maybe, because there are other countries like Israel, there are other settings like EU, not just Taiwan and South Korea, which are important for the semiconductor ecosystem as well. So you can bring them in at a later point of time when they are more comfortable. But the idea is, can you at least begin with a few things? Now, I'll tell you what are the kinds of things that they can do. Very specifically, one, a lot of, like, really began in this session, that they are trying for a lot of self-sufficiency, and every country is trying to fund their own entire semiconductor ecosystem. And my argument has been that actually government should do what companies can't, which means there are, for example, can the four countries form arrangements to facilitate more exchange between the companies in each other's countries, right? So for example, in the semiconductor space, there is a lot of development which happens through research, visitation, joint development, licensing, all of these things, right? So the idea is, can governments have a role in each of these elements, right? So reducing export controls, reducing investment screening, reducing visa requirements for employment opportunities within the trusted groups, having something like a trusted partners program where you can invest in each other countries with lesser investment screening barriers, or even trying for some moonshot ideas, right, like composite semiconductors, etc. So all these are some of the areas where these four countries have the wherewithal to begin right now, right? You don't need Taiwan or South Korea to be in for you start off. So that is one thing. The second idea, I think, which these four countries can do is building trust in each other's sort of legal IP enforcement mechanisms. For example, there have been patent prosecution highways between US, Japan, US, Canada, etc., where we can sort of think of, can the Quad countries also agree on this so that they share information with each other on IP theft, etc., and build a more trusted ecosystem. And third, final idea, I think one thing which can begin now is, we are speaking at this National Center for Excellence, but can the Quad think of a Quad Center of Excellence where some ideas like hardware security, which you mentioned, Deepak, that is one area of interest for all four countries. So can hardware security be one of the areas where the semiconductor supply chain reliance, supply chain initiative, which the Quad is working on, invest in, right? So that can bring in expertise from all four areas and can take the expertise forward. Last but not the least, a lot of this depends on movement of human capital, movement of experienced resources from one country to the other. So again, as I said, if we have the four governments agreeing on reducing barriers to movement of experienced professionals, whether it is in cybersecurity or semiconductors, there is a lot of organic collaboration that can take place. Currently, as Sonia mentioned, that there are still some technology exchange barriers, and countries might not be always very happy with exchanging our technology transfer. So I think Quad is that platform where you can begin to sort of dismantle some of the really tightly wound technology transfer regulations, because there is no other way that you can dominate the space until and unless more and more countries come together.
Yeah.
It's not about one country building the entire ecosystem.
Pranay, can you just wrap up? Thanks. Okay. So, Sonia, when we are looking at these type of things, movement of people, movement of capital is one type of thing. But of course, the moment we are talking about cybersecurity, we are talking in terms of the digital cyberspace. One of the other important things is in terms of movement of data itself. So, how do you see, and just like Pranay did mention, can we create something like a bubble of trust across these four countries, for example, to start with, in terms of movement of data itself? Okay. And second thing is, we have also seen, for example, India joined Vasanar arrangement a few years back. Okay. And at the same time, right from 2013 onwards, there have been discussions at Vasanar, which, of course, in 2015, the Department of Commerce in the US had initiated a proceeding, which ultimately was halted at that point of time in terms of coming out with some additional licensing requirement for export control in the US, for example. Okay. And just to put it simply like this, any large IT company and in the US, for example, and if we, many of them do have people from other countries. So there are a lot of Indians, for example, working in Microsoft and Google and etc. Now, those requirements, if they had been implemented in that fashion, which were announced in May of 2015, effectively it would have meant that even if there were two guys sitting next to each other cubicles, they could not share the information if the nationality was different. Okay, and of course, this thing went back to the drawing board at that point of time. So when we are looking at these type of things, that some countries are talking at the Wassenaar arrangement, I mentioned about CCRA earlier, and of course now we are seeing increasingly things around data localization. And so, what are the first principles that you think we should evolve in terms of at least sharing data in terms of cross-border data flows across these four countries, at least to start with?
Mm. I think it was Abhishur Prakash who's written a book called The World is Becoming Vertical. And he described that we are in a world that has more and more walls and barriers being put up. And those walls and barriers are being driven by things like 5G and AI and technology. In the same way, you mentioned data security, that's another, or sovereignty, that's another wall that's being put up. Or IP or borders, they're all walls around us that limit our and make our world smaller. And it really resonated with me, Pranay's comments around that bubble of trust. And if we're seeing that the new world order is characterized by critical and cyber technologies driving up vertical walls and barriers, then I think the question might become, who do we want to be trapped, or who is in our bubble, who is in the room, who are we enclosed with? And I really, second the comments made about the importance of interoperability of the digital ecosystems of the Quad countries that both Pranay and Aditi have spoken about. And whether that is, interoperability of our data sovereignty principles, whether it's about migration flows of people in our cybersecurity industries, whether it's about IP, whether it's about creating incentives for the private sector to come along and lead and be in the same room with government and working in the strategic interests of government. These are all really important aspects to how we overcome these barriers and break down these walls with those that we want to. So I have nothing more to add to what Pranay has said, because I think he has really listed out four really important areas to investigate further from a research perspective on what it will take to go from rhetoric about Quad cooperation and cyber and critical technology to actual reality and something to show for it. And it's not until we address the very pedestrian things of IP regulation, data sovereignty, and migration like that's not very exciting. It's a bit boring to talk about, but that's what needs to be talked about before we can talk about the limitless possibilities of what cooperation in this area can bring.
Okay. So, Sonia, you did talk about, let's say, what is it that we should do in terms of from rhetoric to reality, from intent to implementation? How do we go ahead? So, Aditi, when we are looking at these things, and let me come to two specific aspects here. One is obviously we have this whole discussion right now in the country from between 5G and 5GI, for example. I mean, so 5GI being a standard which has been approved by TSDSI, and some of the operators recently have written to the government that yes, 5GI is a standard, but then this is something that should be taken to the international level, so that not only the standard is implemented within India, but actually it becomes a part of parcel of the global standard which is being developed under the aegis of 3GPP there for 5G, and as and when that happens, obviously ecosystem will also develop. Whereas there are some indications that if this is standard is sort of enforced in a way mandated, there may not be sufficient ecosystem at this point of time in terms of supporting that in terms of devices as well as the equipment in the core networks side. And the second thing is, Sonia did mention about what is it that should be done across that the countries and the companies should. I mean, Pranay did mention about this point about countries should do what companies can't do. Okay, and Sonia did mention about having better cooperation across different countries. But even if beyond going to different countries and different companies, what are the type of structures that we have within India, for example, for cooperation across the government, across the public sector and the private sector? So two questions very specifically. One being on the 5GI, how do we resolve that? And what is it that we do there, which not only leads in terms of 5G itself, but actually sets a standard and gives a direction for us in terms of going forward in general about cybersecurity, the way we are talking in terms of quiet. And second is in terms of the PPP itself, how are things evolving, or where are you seeing some tensions or challenges in that
Yeah, sure. Thank
in
you.
India?
I'll just use my own experience now and tell you about, something that I learned while I was working. So I feel like a lot of these conversations and, development of standards are typically facilitated by, not by governments, not even by industry. Sometimes, like the thing I talked about, community was important for me. I felt that,
Hmm.
for example, a lot of regulation and a lot of standards around internet governance, right? They evolved because we had so much conversation going on internet governance, and we have noticed that as it has grown and grown over a period of 10 years, right? We also have some standard setting bodies where admittedly, a lot of companies participate, world leaders participate, but I felt a lot of momentum around, let's say, network neutrality, open internet. All of this took place because there was so much momentum around these issues, so much awareness, so many decentralized forms of participation. It wasn't led by a particular government or a particular industry body, right? As far as emerging tech is concerned, I think we lack that right now. I'm not saying there's nothing existing, but I feel in that concerted effort, that the way internet took on, maybe it was an easier thing to understand, or probably a lot of people by then had started using internet and they understood it. I understand emerging tech is a little difficult, topic to understand, but the more you work, and now because now we have technology which is ubiquitous, right? Like there's so many people, like there are younger people who understand much better. So I think there is a need to have this movement, or not the movement, but probably have these knowledge centers where communities can participate at the international level. And maybe even India, for example, can leverage its strength, leverage the strengths of these communities to take the conversation at the more global level, to be able to push through, like, let's say if you want to talk about 5GI standards, it has its fallouts, but the thing is that it is great for probably access, for a lot of people who probably haven't been able to access internet so far. So I think these are some things that we need to speak out in the open, and probably debate about merits, and probably like talk about why it's important, what we need, what our priorities are. So this is the way probably in which we can go forward. I'm sorry, I think this was about 5GI, and the second question I forgot. It
About
is
the PPP, public
public.
private partnerships.
So yes, I think what I feel now, again, about I work very closely with engineers, And as a lawyer, I work with those who create technologies. But honestly, I feel it's very difficult for governments to or those people who are outside of technology development to really grasp what is happening or how you regulate it, or even like when we propose solutions for security, because these are so critically and closely tied into how you've developed the technology itself, right? So in India specifically, we look at a lot of startups, and it is absolutely essential to work with those who are architects of these technologies. If you are planning to leave out, like there was a time when engineers worked in isolation, but if you are thinking of leaving out engineers and not having them, on the regulatory in the like regulatory talks, I think it's a high chance that they will not understand what you're trying to do. There's a very high chance they will never be able to produce trustworthy products. Trustworthy in the sense, not just that they abide by ethics, but also the fact that they can have features like privacy by design or security by design in their products. And a designer has to envision where the product is going to end up, has to envision why and who is going to be using the products, and what features he or she will need to add to make it use worthy. And if you don't have people who are, if you don't collaborate and consult with people, it is never going to work. So I think what I feel is that when we talk about PPP partnerships, we need to very cleverly strategize who we are going to be speaking to. Absolutely important that we speak to technologists. Absolutely, we collaborate with people probably who understand technologies, who may not be technologists, like communities, so that we can at least have more information flow. Also, we can have better regulations around this and better
Okay.
standards. Thank you.
So when we are looking at these things, I mean, one thing that's very clear to me is that while technology is global, it tends to be global. Even if technological flows may or may not be global in that sense, in terms of IP controls and other things, but technology in general is global, whereas policy becomes more tends to be more local, and so obviously there's this tension between these two dimensions. On the other hand, we also see, as you mentioned, Aditi, that it's not just about the countries and companies, but it's also about communities of practitioners, of interest groups, and others. And that's why what we do need is, an, even within the system of Quad, although it's ultimately a multilateral, plurilateral arrangement at some level, but there has to be some platforms we do need where the industry, where the companies, as well as the communities, as practitioners, as a multi-stakeholder platform is needed, so that we have a better dialogue and also better decisions and debates on these type of issues going forward. And the other thing that comes to my mind is, I mean, on 1st of March 2015, when Prime Minister Mr. Modi spoke at NASSCOM's Silver Jubilee, of course, it was almost 45 minutes. We talked about multiple things about NASSCOM and the opportunities, etc. But towards the end, he did mention something interesting. He said, and this was, by the way, when he had been as a prime minister less than a year. Okay. And what he said, that whenever he talks to his counterparts around the world and asks them what keeps them awake, the response is that it is cybersecurity for most of them. And one of the clarion call that he had given on that day was that can NASSCOM create an opportunity, create a task force that can come out with a vision for people in India, the Indian practitioners, Indian professionals, especially the youth, who can offer peaceful sleep to the world at large from cybersecurity concerns. So this was something, actually, if you today, if we see the PIB press release of that day, that was the headline. And in that context, today, when we are looking at this whole issue around the Quad, I think it's important for us to remember the same type of direction that was given there. So what we had seen on 1st of March that time, and then what we saw quick in terms of 15th of August last year, the announcement, and the way we are talking in 2021 in terms of Quad and several other things. I think going forward, what we do need is this whole multi-stakeholder platform and mechanism, so that these countries, companies, and communities, people from all these three can come together and evolve something. Now, before I wrap up, I just want Pranay to make a very quick intervention. However, Pranay, we are less than 2 minutes away from closing.
Yeah, no, I just
Yeah,
wanted to
Pranay.
take that point forward and say, like, DSCI itself came up with this handbook for data protection and privacy for AI developers, I think a few months back. I think that serves as a really good model where the government, companies, and communities have been brought together. And Deepak, to your point, I think the Quad Tech Network expressly serves this purpose, which you mentioned. And this tech network has been established where think tanks, also companies from each other's countries are collaborating on a few areas, so that has begun. I think a lot of Australia is driving a lot of this Quad Tech Network ideas, and you will see some of the new projects coming out because of that cooperation.
Thanks, Pranay, for this plug-in. And as we come to the close of this session, I think DSCI's work is cut out well. Ultimately, what we do need is a scenario where organizations like DSCI and their counterparts in other countries also, and not just one, there could be multiple of them. They all need to support this type of initiative. And ultimately, we do need some sort of codification, as Pranay mentioned, where we provide broad guidance and let things evolve from ground up. So obviously, there's this top-down declarations, but we also need some ground-up community development. So with that hopeful and positive note, let me bring this particular session to a close. I thank all the panelists, all the three panelists, and it's back to the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
have a nice day ahead, or
Thank
good
you.
night, depending on which time zone you are in.
Good night to you.
Thank you.